The cheap lace of the wedding dress scratched against my skin like dry straw, a constant, irritating reminder of the absurdity of my existence. It was a size too big, pinned haphazardly at the waist, smelling faintly of mothballs and the damp, musty air of the church basement where my aunt had found it. Outside, the London rain was relentless, a gray curtain that washed away the colors of the city, leaving only the grime of the pavement and the hopelessness that had settled in my bones. I was 18 years old, and I was standing at the altar of a community hall that smelled of floor wax and stale beer, waiting for a groom who was never going to show. My Auntie Beatrice sat in the front row, her laughter sharp and jagged like breaking glass, echoing in the cavernous, empty room. This was her masterpiece, her final act of cruelty before casting me out onto the streets. There was no groom. There was only a debt she claimed my dead parents owed, and this humiliating charade was the interest payment. She had told the neighbors, the community, everyone we knew, that Mary was getting married to a wealthy benefactor, raising my hopes just to shatter them publicly. I looked down at my hands, dark against the dingy white fabric, and tried to stop them from trembling. I had spent my life making myself small, trying to be invisible so her wrath would pass over me, but today, under the flickering fluorescent lights, I was the center of attention, a spectacle of misery. The few people scattered in the pews were shifting uncomfortably, checking their watches, the air thick with second-hand embarrassment. I closed my eyes, wishing the floor would open up and swallow me whole, wishing I could dissolve into the shadows and never be seen again. The humiliation burned in my chest, hot and suffocating, a stark contrast to the cold draft leaking in from the poorly sealed windows. I was a prop in a joke I didn't understand, a punchline written in the ink of my own desperation. The double doors at the back of the hall didn't just open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the hinges, letting in a gust of wind and the roar of the storm outside. But the noise died instantly, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The laughter in the front row strangled into a cough. I lifted my head, blinking against the sudden intrusion. Silhouette against the gray light of the afternoon, a man stood in the threshold. He was not the imaginary groom Beatrice had taunted me with. He was something else entirely. Even from this distance, across the scuffed linoleum floor, the power radiating from him was palpable, a physical weight that pressed down on my shoulders. He stepped into the light, and I forgot how to breathe. He was Korean, older, perhaps 40, with a face carved from cold marble and eyes that held the terrifying stillness of a predator before the strike. He wore a suit that cost more than this entire building, the fabric dark and sleek, absorbing the harsh lights rather than reflecting them. Raindrops glistened like diamonds on the shoulders of his coat. He didn't look at the guests. He didn't look at my aunt, who had gone pale, her mouth hanging open in a silent scream.
He looked only at me.
It was an intense, unblinking gaze that felt like it was peeling back the layers of my skin to see the trembling soul beneath. Behind him, for other men materialized, silent and broad, blocking the exit, turning the hall into a sealed box. The air grew electric, charged with violence restrained by a thread. I should have been terrified, and I was, but beneath the fear, there was a strange, magnetic pull, a recognition. As he walked down the aisle, his footsteps echoing with the precision of a ticking clock, I realized with a jolt that he wasn't walking into a church. He was walking into a war zone he had already conquered. He stopped at the foot of the altar, towering over me. Up close, he was devastatingly handsome, sharp angles and smooth skin, but there was a cruelty in the set of his jaw that warned of danger. The smell of him hit me then, expensive leather, rain, and a smoky, woody cologne that smelled like a forest fire wrapped in velvet. It drowned out the smell of the floor wax. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't ask who I was. He simply reached out, his hand large and gloved in black leather, and brushed a stray curl away from my face. The touch was shocking, not because it was aggressive, but because it was terrifyingly gentle. "You are wearing the wrong dress, Mary," he said. His voice was a deep baritone, smooth and absolute, vibrating through the floorboards and up into my chest. He spoke English with a precise, elegant accent that made every word sound like a decree. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird.
Who?
"Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Before he could answer, Auntie Beatrice scrambled up from her pew, her heels clacking frantically. "Here now. Who do you think you are? This is a private." One of the men behind him moved, a blur of motion, and suddenly Beatrice was silenced, not by a hand, but by the sheer menacing aura of the guard who stepped into her path. The man in front of me didn't even turn his head. His focus remained entirely on me, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. "I am the man who's been waiting for you to grow up," he said, and the words sent a shiver of ice and heat down my spine. "The debt is paid. The joke is over. You are coming with me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, as inevitable as the tide. "I don't understand," I stammered, my hands clutching the wilting bouquet of carnations I'd been forced to hold. "I don't know you." He stepped closer, invading my personal space until all I could see was the dark abyss of his eyes. "You do not know me yet," he corrected, his voice dropping to a murmur meant only for us. "But I know you. I know you hate the sound of thunder. I know you hide packets of sugar in your pocket because you are afraid of going hungry. I know you dream of the ocean, though you have never seen it." My breath hitched, panic rising in my throat. How could he know that? The sugar packets were my deepest shame, a habit born of years of food insecurity in Beatrice's house. "Who are you?" I asked again, louder this time, desperation leaking into my tone. "My name is Kongde," he said, the syllables rolling off his tongue with power. "And you, Mary, are mine," he turned then, finally acknowledging the room. He didn't shout. He simply looked at my aunt with an expression of utter boredom and disdain. "If anyone follows us," he said to the room at large, "they will be removed." Permanently, he held out his hand to me, palm up, the leather glove creaking softly. It was a terrifying offer. Take the hand of the monster or stay with the demons I knew. I looked at Beatrice, who was trembling with a mix of rage and terror, and then I looked at the dark, powerful stranger who looked at me as if I were a queen in rags. I dropped the bouquet. It hit the floor with a wet thud. I placed my hand in his. His fingers closed around mine, swallowing my hand completely, a shackle and a shield all at once. The walk to the car was a blur of rain and adrenaline. One of his guards held a massive black umbrella over us, ensuring not a single drop touched Kongde, though the hem of my ridiculous dress dragged through the puddles, turning gray and heavy with mud. He guided me into the back of a sleek, black limousine that looked like a spaceship compared to the rusted buses I was used to. The door closed with a heavy, solid thunk, sealing out the noise of the city, the rain, and my old life. The interior was a sanctuary of cream leather and warm amber light. It smelled of him, that intoxicating blend of power and spice. I pressed myself against the door, trying to make myself as small as possible, terrified of staining the pristine seats. Kongde sat opposite me, his legs crossed, looking perfectly at ease, as if kidnapping a bride from a fake wedding was a standard Tuesday afternoon. He watched me, his gaze tracing the line of my jaw, the pulse fluttering in my throat. He reached into a compartment next to him and pulled out a small glass bottle of water and a wrapped chocolate. "Eat," he commanded softly. "You have not eaten since yesterday morning. I stared at him, my eyes widening. He was right. Beatrice had locked me in the room to prepare. How? I started, but the words died. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, revealing a tailored vest and the hint of a shoulder holster beneath. I told you. I watch what is mine. He leaned forward, the sudden proximity making me flinch, but he only placed the chocolate in my hand. I am not a good man, Mary. I have done terrible things to acquire the power to sit in this car. But I will never let you go hungry again. And I will never let anyone laugh at you again. The car began to move, gliding forward smoothly, carrying me away from the poverty and the ridicule, toward a future that felt terrifyingly golden and dangerously obscure. I unwrapped the chocolate with shaking fingers, the sound deafening in the quiet luxury, and took a bite. It tasted like salvation. It tasted like a trap. We drove for what felt like hours, leaving the grimy, congested streets of the city for the winding, tree-lined roads of the countryside. The rain lashed against the tinted windows, but inside, it was warm and silent. I watched the world blur by, the gray concrete giving way to green fields obscured by the storm. Every time I glanced at Kongdae, he was already looking at me, his dark eyes unreadable, possessive. We finally slowed, turning through a massive set of wrought iron gates that groaned open automatically. A winding driveway led up a hill, flanked by ancient trees that looked like skeletal sentinels in the rain. At the top stood a mansion of gray stone and glass, sprawling and imposing, lit from within by a warm, golden glow that spilled out onto the wet gravel. It looked like a castle from a fairy tale, but the kind where the prince is actually a dragon. Where are we? I whispered. Home. Kongdae replied simply. The car stopped, and the driver opened the door instantly. Kongdae stepped out and extended his hand again. This time, I took it without hesitation, my resistance worn down by exhaustion and awe. He led me up the stone steps, the massive front doors opening before we even reached them. Inside, the foyer was a cavern of black marble and crystal chandeliers. A line of staff stood waiting, heads bowed. An older Korean woman in a severe black dress stepped forward. Master Kongdae, she bowed low. Welcome home, he nodded to her, then pulled me slightly forward, his hand heavy on the small of my back. This is Mary, he announced to the silent hall. She is the mistress of this house now. Her word is law, second only to mine. I felt dizzy. The sheer scale of the wealth, the obedience of the staff, the heat of his hand through the thin lace of my dress. It was too much. Take her to the master suite, he ordered the woman, then looked down at me, his expression softening just a fraction.
Go. Bathe. Rest.
We will have dinner, and then we will discuss your new life. He turned and walked toward a dark hallway, leaving me standing on the marble, surrounded by strangers who bowed to me, trapped in a gilded cage that was bigger than my entire world had been just hours ago. The master suite was larger than the entire apartment I had shared with my aunt, a sprawling expanse of midnight blue walls and dark mahogany floors that seemed to swallow the light. The older woman, who introduced herself as Madame Park, guided me into a bathroom that rivaled a spa, the air thick with a scent of lavender and steam. She didn't speak as she unpinned the wretched wedding dress, her movements efficient and clinical, but not unkind. When the heavy, cheap fabric finally fell to the floor, pooling around my ankles like a dead skin I had finally shed, I felt a sudden, violent urge to weep. I stood shivering in my threadbare undergarments, the grime of London and the shame of the day clinging to me like a second skin. Madame Park gestured to the massive sunken tub, which was filled with water so hot it sent ribbons of steam curling toward the high ceiling. Wash, she said gently, pointing to a row of glass bottles filled with amber and gold liquids. He dislikes the smell of the city, I stepped into the water, and the heat was a shock to my system, stinging my frozen toes and the raw skin where the dress had rubbed. I sank down until the water lapped at my chin, closing my eyes as the warmth seeped into my bones, thawing the ice that had lived in my marrow for years. I scrubbed myself raw, using a rough sponge and a soap that smelled of sandalwood and honey, watching the water turn murky with the dust of the church and the dirt of the streets. It felt like a baptism, a ritual cleansing of Mary the unwanted orphan, making way for whoever this man expected me to be. When I finally emerged, pink-skinned and trembling with exhaustion, Madam Park was waiting with a robe made of silver silk. It slipped over my skin like water, cool and impossibly smooth, a tactile shock after years of scratchy wool and polyester. I caught my reflection in the fogged mirror, my dark skin glowing against the silver fabric, my hair curling wildly from the humidity, my eyes wide and dark. I looked like a stranger. I looked like someone who belonged in this tower of stone and glass. I touched the cold glass of the mirror, wondering if the girl on the other side was a prisoner or a princess, and realizing with a sinking heart that in Kongdae's world, there was likely no difference. Dinner was served in a room that felt less like a place to eat and more like a tribunal. A long table of black obsidian stretched out before a roaring fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows against the walls. Kongdae sat at the head, now stripped of his jacket and tie, the sleeves of his white dress shirt rolled up to reveal forearms that were corded with muscle and marked with the faint, white lines of old scars. He looked up as I entered, his eyes tracking my movement across the room with that same predatory intensity he had shown in the church. A single place setting was laid out to his right, forcing me to sit close to him, well within his reach. The table was laden with food, roasted meats, glazed vegetables, bowls of rice that steamed in the cool air, more food than I would usually see in a month. "Sit," he commanded, pouring a glass of dark red wine. I obeyed, sinking into the high-backed velvet chair. "Why?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the vast room. "Why me? There are beautiful women everywhere. Why did you come for me?" He picked up his knife and fork, slicing into a rare steak with surgical precision. Blood welled up on the plate. "Beauty is common, Mary. Resilience is rare," he paused, looking at me over the rim of his wine glass. "I saw you 3 years ago. You were working at that diner on 4th Street. It was snowing. You were taking the trash out, wearing a coat that was too thin and shoes with holes in them. You didn't cry. You didn't complain. You just looked at the sky with a defiance that captivated me. My fork clattered onto my plate. 3 years? He had been watching me for 3 years? The thought was terrifying, a violation of the privacy I thought I had, but simultaneously, it was a balm to my loneliness. I hadn't been invisible. "I waited," he continued, his voice dropping an octave. "I waited for you to be of age. I waited for your aunt's gambling debts to reach a point where she would sell you. I bought her debt, Mary. I own it. And now I own the solution." He reached out, his warm fingers brushing against my wrist, sending a jolt of electricity up my arm.
"Eat."
"You are too thin. I cannot have you breaking." Later that evening, the reality of my confinement, however luxurious, began to set in. I had wandered into the library, a 2-story room filled with leather-bound books, seeking an escape, but instead found a reminder of the violence that underpinned this sanctuary. The heavy oak doors were ajar, and I heard Kongdae's voice, cold and sharp as a razor, drifting from the adjacent office. "I don't care about the logistics," he was saying, the tone devoid of the warmth he showed me. "If they step foot in London again, burn the warehouse." With them inside, I froze, my hand hovering over a book spine. The brutality of his words clashed violently with the image of the man who had gently wiped rain from my face. I moved to the doorway, peering through the crack. He was standing behind a massive desk, a phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of cruel indifference. On the screens behind him, I saw feeds from security cameras, the gate, the grounds, and the hallway I was standing in. He turned his head, looking directly at the camera feed that showed me cowering by the door. He didn't look angry. He just hung up the phone and walked to the doorway, pulling it open. I stumbled back, caught. Eavesdropping is a dangerous habit, he murmured, towering over me. I wanted to know if I could call someone. I lied, my heart hammering. Who would you call? He asked, stepping into my personal space, forcing me back against the bookshelves. Beatrice? She has already left the city with the money I gave her. She didn't ask about you once. The truth of his words hit me like a physical blow. I knew it, but hearing it confirmed by him shattered the last fragile hope I had of being loved by my family. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and humiliating. Kongdae's expression shifted, the cruelty vanishing, replaced by that dark, obsessive devotion. He boxed me in, placing his hands on the shelf on either side of my head. You don't need them, he whispered, his breath fanning across my forehead. The world out there is cold and indifferent to you. Here, you are the sun. I protect what is mine, Mary. I destroy anything that threatens it. Do not ask to leave the cage, little bird. The hawks are waiting outside, and I am the only one who can keep them at bay. The storm that had been brewing all day finally broke over the mansion with apocalyptic fury. Thunder shook the very foundations of the house, rattling the window panes in their frames. I was in the master bedroom, huddled in the center of the massive bed, clutching the silk sheets to my chest. The fear of thunder was a childish thing, a remnant of nights spent alone in the dark while Beatrice partied, but it paralyzed me nonetheless. The door opened, and Kongdae entered. He had changed into dark lounge pants and a soft gray sweater, looking deceptively domestic. He saw me trembling and crossed the room in 3 long strides. The noise scares you, he stated, not a question but a fact from his dossier of my life.
He didn't mock me.
Instead, he climbed onto the bed, settling behind me, pulling my back flush against his chest. His arms wrapped around me, heavy and solid, a human fortress against the storm. It's just sound, he murmured into my hair, his lips brushing the sensitive skin of my neck. It cannot touch you here. I should have pushed him away. I should have fought for my autonomy. But I was so tired of being strong, so tired of shivering alone. I leaned back into him, surrendering to the heat of his body and the scent of expensive cologne and man. You kept me, I whispered into the darkness. You bought me like a piece of furniture, his grip tightened, possessive and bruising. No, he corrected, his voice rough. I rescued you like a relic from a burning building. Do you think you were free before? You were a slave to poverty, to that woman's cruelty. I have given you a different kind of chain, yes. But mine is made of gold, and I hold the other end. He turned me in his arms then, his hand cupping my face, his thumb tracing the curve of my bottom lip. Tell me you want to leave, he challenged, his eyes searching mine in the dim light. Tell me to open the gates, and I will drive you back to that basement. I opened my mouth to speak, to demand my freedom, but the words turned to ash. I thought of the cold rain, the hunger, the loneliness. I looked at the man who had burned the world to keep me warm. I don't want to go back, I breathed. A look of triumph flashed in his eyes, fierce and terrifying. Good, he growled, before bringing his mouth down on mine, sealing our pact with a kiss that tasted of ruin and salvation. 3 months later, the girl who had stood trembling in a cheap wedding dress was a distant memory, a ghost I had left behind in the London rain. I stood on the balcony of the master suite, wrapped in a cashmere shawl, watching the sun set over the sprawling estate that was now my world. My hands, once rough from scrubbing floors, were manicured and adorned with a ring that carried a sapphire the size of a robin's egg, a heavy, glittering collar that marked me as his. I heard the heavy tread of his footsteps behind me, the sound that had once elicited fear now bringing a sense of calm. Kongdae stepped out into the cool evening air, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder. We fit together now, two broken pieces that had formed a jagged, dangerous whole. "What are you thinking?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against my spine. "I was thinking about the ocean," I admitted, leaning my head back against him. "You said I dreamed of it." He kissed the side of my neck, his lips warm against my skin. "We leave tomorrow," he said simply. "Italy. The coast. You'll tire of the water before I let you leave it," I smiled, a small, secret thing. I knew now that he wasn't a hero. He was a villain in a bespoke suit, a man who commanded fear and dealt in violence. But he was my villain. He had taken the invisible, unwanted girl and placed her on a pedestal so high the mud of the world couldn't reach her. The gilded cage Beatrice had mocked was real, but she had been wrong about one thing. It wasn't a prison. It was a fortress. I turned in his arms, looking up into the dark eyes that saw everything, knew everything, and owned everything. "I'm not afraid anymore," I told him. He smirked, that dangerous, devastating expression that made my heart race. "You should be," he whispered, pulling me closer until there was no air left between us. "But as long as you are with me, you never have to be afraid of anyone else." The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the world into darkness, but in the circle of his arms, I was finally, irrevocably found.